Maayong buntag, naimbag nga bigat, magandang umaga. In this video, we will be discussing the aspects of the national language. So, before we begin, the things that we will be discussing are things that they don't really teach in schools, nor are these information found in any books. However, I found it essential to discuss because first, this is one of the underlying principles as to why we are doing what we are doing. And second, this may be the reason why some people who are students or even graduates of even prestigious universities are making mistakes that are rather ridiculous when it comes to the national language discussion. So, with that said, let us begin. So, this video lecture will be divided into two parts. First, we will be discussing the theoretical framework, wherein we will discuss the fundamental principles on how to properly view or assess the national language. Then we will look at practical applications, wherein we will see real life situations and assess or see or view whatever why they are correct or wrong. So, with that said, let us begin with the theoretical framework. So it is critical and what most important to know that the national language is composed of two aspects. First, there is a legal or political aspect, then there is a linguistic or realistic aspect. It is critical because the failure to know this will make one posit fallacious arguments or contentions that are utterly wrong. Why? Because you will raise premises that are not significant to your arguments. As a result, people will not see that there is even a problem. And as of now, as a result, this will make the status quo propagate for so long as it is. And it's almost been a century since the national language policy has been implemented. So, what are the problems? The problems are at least those concerning this topic. First, the national language is not being implemented properly, if at all. There is no concrete plan as to how to develop the national language. Second, or third, there is no proper vision or definition for the national language. Fourth, Tagalog is unjustly imposed. Fifth, since Tagalog is being treated as the national language, but not really, Tagalog Tagalog standard is a mess. So for oftentimes when we raise these scenarios or contentions, the people usually say that we are anti-Tagalog. However, that is not the case. We are raising this issue because there is a mandate to be followed, and the mandate to be followed, as we will discuss, it is not to impose Tagalog on each and every Filipinos. And Tagalog being the national language or currently the de facto national language is not the problem per se. The problem per se is that there is a mandate and that mandate is not being followed. So let's begin with the legal or political aspect. So if you do not know before that you will know if the that you should apply the legal or political aspect if you are confided with questions such as what should be the national language? What is the basis of the national language? To a certain extent, how should the national language be developed? If those are your questions or the things that you will need to answer are those sorts of questions, then you are looking at the legal or political aspect. And the implements of the legal or political aspects or legal or political aspect, meaning the things you will use to answer the questions that we have asked are first, among others, constitution, pertinent laws, legislative history, statutory construction. Statutory construction, if you're aware, is a subject in law on how to properly read or understand our laws, including the Constitution. Um, Among these principles in statutory construction is verbal his, wherein you will read as to if it is clear, then that is the meaning, ordinary meaning. Well, further, here is a screenshot of the Constitution, particularly Article 14, Section 6. Because if you do not know, the national language is being mandated by the Constitution. It's not just any laws for that matter. So for paragraph 1, the national language of the Philippines is Filipino. So the basis of the national language. As mentioned, the national language is mandated by the 1987 Constitution, particularly Article 14, Section 6. Number 2, while the national language is in the 1987 Constitution, it did not, however, started with the 1987 Constitution, as it started with the 1935 Constitution. The very first Constitution, at least when the Philippines became independent of foreign powers. But are we really? I guess I digress. So historical names of the national language. Despite the national language started in 1935, as mentioned, it did not originally carry the name Filipino. So in 1935, it was simply referred to as the common national language. We can see this in Article 13, Section 3 in 1942 Constitution. It was named Tagalog. In Article 9, Section 2 in 1973 Constitution, it is named Filipino. Filipino with a P. In Article 15, Section 3 in 1987 Constitution, the Constitution we are using today it is named Filipino with an F in Article 14, Section 6. So the most important part here, or thing we should know here in the history of the names of the national language, is that at some point it was named Tagalog. And some people who are non-Tagalogs will be angry at this, but this is actually something positive if you are with our end goal to separate the national language and Tagalog, because this is a positive thing. It's hard. I will not explain it here because it will take too long. Anyway, if you want something like this, we will be discussing it further in a separate video, simply focusing on the legal or political aspect. So two things, as mentioned, what's important here is that at some point the national language really did become Tagalog, and throughout the years or the iterations of the constitutions, the national language has been changing its name, which is important. Okay, so as mentioned, the name of the national language in the 1987 Constitution is Filipino. And it makes the mandate clear that Filipino is the national language and not Tagalog. In statutory construction, this is important because what is Filipino? Not Tagalog. Verbally his. So simply put, the mandate, but since the national language is Filipino, it doesn't mean that it justifies it. It doesn't make it anything. It just imposes that Filipino should be the national language, not anything else. So to summarize the political or legal aspect, political or legal aspect should be answered by its own implements. The national language is mandated by the Constitution. Throughout the different iterations of the constitutions, the names of the national language was changing. And the mandate is clear that the national language is Filipino. So how can we know that the mandate is actually being followed? Then we will refer to the real linguistic or realistic aspect. So what are the questions that can be answered by the linguistic or realistic aspect? What is a language? and or a dialect? What is the language actually being taught in schools? How can we make the national language distinct? Is the national language really just Tagalog or any language for that matter? If those are your questions, or the answer to those are what you are looking for, then you are looking should be looking at the linguistic or realistic aspect. So the implements of the linguistic aspect, you will use, of course, theories or principles in linguistics. What is a language? What is a dialect? You will use comparative linguistic, comparative method, lexicostatistics, Wadish list, those things. So often this um, this phrase is often used when some people are dealing with Filipino versus Tagalog. Language is a dialect with an army. However, that is merely a political definition. So for our purposes, we will refer or use the meaning supplied by Dr. Soberano in her book Dialects of Marinduque Tagalog. So according to her, every language is a collection of many dialects, all more or less mutually intelligible and sharing a common core structure, but differing from one another in many ways. Each dialect is adapted to the needs and interests of the speech community that it uses, while at the same time making use of the features of structure that constitute the common language. So basically, a speech variety is considered a language if they are or rather a speech variety, two speech varieties are considered to belong in one language if they are, generally speaking, mutually intelligible. Because they are mutually intelligible, meaning kakaintindihan sila because they share a common structure. And dialects, on the other hand, are varieties of a language because they are adapted to the needs and interests of the speech community. So examples of a language: Tagalog, Cebuano, Ilocano, Kapampangan, Maranao. And to correct the common misconception among Filipinos, these are not dialects. They are their own languages. Paano natin nasabi? Because they are not mutually intelligible. So kung isang Ilocano, nag-Ilocano, na imbag nga bigat, for example, hindi naiintindihan ng isang Tagalog yun dahil ibang wika ang Ilocano sa Tagalog. Napakasimple. So examples of dialects are sa Tagalog, mga dialects ng Tagalog, there are may Tagalog, there is a Tagalog dialect in Manila, there is a Tagalog dialect in Batangas, there is Tagalog dialect called for Tayabas, Danay Paete. In Manila dialect, this is the most common form of Tagalog that people use because this is the one used in the capital. In Batangas is the most another notable dialect of Tagalog. The main difference between Manila and Tagalog is that the conjugation and sa Southern Tagalog dialects like for example, kumakain ka ba ng isda? Other dialects would say nakain ka ba ng isda? And isa pa sa Manila ba yung ginagamit nila, sa Batangas ga, like kumakain like sa Manila, kumakain ka ba ng isda? Sa Batangas, nakain ka ga ng isda, something like that. O sa Tayabas naman, as far as I know, ni-retain nila yung baga, which is yung original word kaya nagkaroon ng ba sa Manila at ga naman sa Batangas. Sa Tanay Paete naman, yung sa dialect sa Rizal area, ang pinaka-dominant feature nito ay they use they use their R's are more pronounced like bunrock, sunrock, ring. In, papansin nyo na this is because D and R, as mentioned, or if you know, are allophones in Tagalog, meaning whether use or D, it doesn't generally change the meaning in Tagalog. So with regards to the national language versus Tagalog, according to the former chairperson of Komisyon sa Wikang Filipino, ang Tagalog, Pilipino at Filipino ba ay magkaibang wika? Hindi. Ang mga ito ay variasyon na mutually intelligible at sa makatuwid ay kabilang sa iisang wika. Ayon sa KWF, ang Filipino ay ang uri ng wika na sinasalita sa Metro Manila at iba pang punong lungsod na pinagtatagpuan ng iba't ibang grupong etniko. Ito ang pinakaprestigyosong uri ng Tagalog at ang wikang ginagamit ng mass media. So basically, according to former KWF chairperson Ricardo Nolasco, that Filipino is just Tagalog because they are mutually intelligible. That Filipino is merely a standard version of Tagalog. And it is not a different language. So basically, if we look at our political or legal aspect, then the legal aspect or the mandate is not being followed because according to the Constitution, the national language should be Filipino. And what is clear that it should not be Tagalog. And in our analysis, or at least in Ricardo Nolasco's analysis, that since first they are mutually intelligible, they are the same language. And further, Tagalog and Filipino, or Filipino as taught, uses the same core vocabulary. For the most part, they use the same articles like ang, nang, and sa. They generally use the same pronouns. So to summarize the linguistic or realistic aspect, first we learn that a language is different from a dialect because first a language, two speech varieties are considered a language if they are generally mutually intelligible. They are mutually intelligible because they share the same core structure. Mutual intelligibility is generally the main guideline used to tell whether something is a language or a dialect. So a language has varieties called dialects because there are variations simply because dialects adapt to the needs of the speech community. So the linguistic aspect is the barometer for us to know whether or not the mandate is being followed. The mandate being the Constitution that mandates that the national language should be Filipino. Even the former KWF chairperson agrees with that Filipino is just Tagalog. So, to summarize our theoretical framework, to properly view the national language, we must recognize its two aspects. There is a political or legal aspect, then there is a linguistic or realistic aspect. And to each of those aspects can only be answered by their own implements. The political or legal aspect is the mandate to be followed, whereas the linguistic or realistic aspect is the barometer for us to know whether the mandate is actually being followed. So let's look at some practical applications. So what will happen if you ignore the aspects of the national language? As mentioned, the failure to know the aspect will make one posit fallacious arguments or contentions that are utterly wrong. In making arguments with regards to the national language, consideration for both aspects is essential for it not to be flawed. Generally speaking, to most Filipinos who argue or who enter into this sorts of discussions do not have a thorough understanding of either the political slash legal aspect and the linguistic aspect. First, they do not understand how to properly view or understand the law, or they don't know what is a language or a dialect, which is why it further um flaws their arguments. Or yeah. So what will happen if you ignore the political or legal aspect? As discussed, the political or legal aspect is the mandate to be followed. Therefore, ignoring the mandate means an arbitrary imposition of a language. So as a reminder, what is the mandate? That the national language is Filipino, and it is clear that it is not Tagalog. Simply put. So this is one of the examples I saw which ignores the political or legal aspect. It came from Reddit, and it says here that unpopular opinion, I think Filipino being Tagalog is just fine. I mean, had they chosen Cebuano or Ilocano, it would have still be the same language rivalries as we have now. I will not read the other paragraphs because it's not um it is not related to our discussion. So this ignores the mandate because this ignores the legal or political aspect because he is just fine, ignores that there is that the constitution actually mandates Filipino and not Tagalog. So his personal opinion on the matter is actually irrelevant because there is a mandate to be followed. Simply put. So this is actually a crude example, but what the this is actually like something like extrajudicial killings. Because in the Constitution, it says there in the Bill of Rights that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That is the mandate of the Constitution. So if you ignore that and engage in extrajudicial killings, I know this is a rather crude example. Anyway, so if you ignore that mandate of the Constitution, then you will end up with extrajudicial killings. And this is like justifying them. You know, um, you know, let's say there is really some benefit in killing people without due process. Like we swipe out, we swipe away the drug killers or drug lords and other evil persons that because instant justice to some extent. And it's still against the constitution because our constitution mandates that everyone, despite their crimes, should be given due process. So like that, this no matter how you justify and no matter how you justify that whatever benefits Tagalog may have as a national language, our constitution mandates Filipino and not Tagalog. And we have seen that in our Article 14, Section 6, that Filipino is the national language. And it is clear from the history of the names of the national language that had our lawmakers intended Tagalog, which would have been named Tagalog and not Filipino. It is plain and simple. This is wrong. This unpopular opinion is wrong because it is ignoring the political or legal aspect that Tagalog is not being imposed, but Filipino. This Filipino. So let's go now with what will happen if you ignore the linguistic or realistic aspect. As discussed, the linguistic or realistic aspect is the barometer for us to know whether or not the mandate is actually being followed. So ignoring the linguistic aspect means ignoring what is actually what is actually happening. This is like just like with the extrajudicial killings, it's like arguing that extrajudicial killings doesn't exist because the Constitution says that no person is being deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. Because what is extrajudicial killings? It is killings without due process. So pag-ibig na. So let's watch one of the my favorite examples, which ignores the linguistic aspect. So I guess let's watch. Kapangyarihan kapag pumasok sa puso ni let's skip a bit because this is just an introduction. Dust up their body and practice. August also happens to El Quezon, who pushed for the establishment, of a national. Former President Manuel L. Quezon, who pushed for the establishment of a national language. Pero ano nga ba talaga ang ating that it was in Quezon's time that the 1935 Constitution was implemented. Wikang pambansa, Filipino or Tagalog? So tignan natin yung ating saligang batas. Ayon sa Article 14, Section 6 na ating Constitution, the national language of the Philippines is Filipino. So malinaw, Filipino, hindi Tagalog ang ating wikang pambansa. Okay, just as mentioned in the political or legal aspect, the mandate to be followed, or which means the national language that should be imposed is Filipino and not Tagalog. To some extent, that he is correct. However, which is why actually I don't like to answer like do you agree in questions like do you agree that the national language is Tagalog, because there are two aspects as mentioned. I know we're this I'm straying a bit, but which is why as mentioned I don't like sort those black and white questions, because the national language is not Tagalog. Well, at least with the political or legal aspect, because the mandate to be followed that the national language should be Filipino and not Tagalog. However, if we are looking at it from the point of view or from the point of view of linguistic or realistic aspect, we can see that it is Tagalog. So let's carry on with the video. Wala. Anyway, so pag-ibig. Ba't natin yung ating saligang batas? Ayon sa Article 14, Section 6 na ating Constitution, the national language of the Philippines is Filipino. So malinaw, Filipino, hindi Tagalog ang So actually walang malinaw dito. Walang malinaw sa argument ng ni Haydarian dito, because he's just saying that there is a mandate of national language which imposes Filipino, whatever that means. And as we've discussed in the political or legal aspect, if we look at statutory construction, what this Filipino means that it is simply not Tagalog. Ating wikang pambansa. So ano yung pinagkaiba ng Filipino and Tagalog? So he now asked the question, what is the difference between Filipino and Tagalog? And this shifts the aspect from political or legal aspect into linguistic aspect, because as mentioned, among the questions that can be answered by the linguistic or realistic aspect is what is actually the national language, because the linguistic or realistic aspect is the barometer we can use to know whether or not the mandate of the political or legal aspect is being followed.
To be clear, Tagalog is the native language of Metro Manila, Calabarzon, Mimaropa, and some parts of Central Luzon.
So far, he is correct.
Ito ang napili ng National Language Institute noong 1937 bilang batayan ng
However, as he argues further, we can see that he is arguing the as mentioned, he shifted from linguist to from the political or legal aspect to linguistic aspect from the moment he asked whether what's the difference between Filipino and Tagalog. However, he's answering it from the point of view of the political or legal aspect, because he is, as we can see, giving us the legislative history.
bansa ng Pilipinas. So sino exactly pumili ng Tagalog? Hindi naman purong Tagalog. Katunayan, only 1 out of 7 members of the Institute is Tagalog. The rest are Waray, Ilocano, Cebuano, Bicolano, Hiligaynon, and Moro. In other words, represented ang iba't ibang regions ng ating bansa. In 1959, the Department of Education
So, actually, walang, yun, walang, ang tanong ay linguistic aspect, pero sinagot niya ng political or legal aspect.
started referring to the national language as Filipino. Eventually, it became Filipino per the 1987 Constitution.
Ayun, this is what we have discussed in the political or legal aspect, that throughout the iterations of the constitutions, the names of the national language was changing. And hindi niya diniscuss yun sa 1935 Constitution.
So ano nga yung Filipino? We know it's based on Tagalog, but how exactly is it?
Actually, this Tagalog, based on Tagalog, does not actually have real basis. Wala siya sa constitution, actually, in any constitution.
Different. Dito papasok yung second clause ng Article 14, Section 6 ng
Ito na naman, mali na naman siya. Because, as mentioned, the political or legal aspect can only answer things that are related to the political or legal aspect, like what is the national language? What is the basis of the national language? What is the history of the national language? And he is asking what is the difference between Tagalog and Filipino, which is a linguistic question, which means it falls within the linguistic or realistic aspect. And you should not be using the political or legal aspect to answer that question, because it will be flawed.
Batas, as Filipino evolves, it shall be further developed and enriched on the basis of existing Philippine and other languages, because it borrows from languages sa loob at sa labas ng bansa.
Ayan, political or legal aspect yung ginagamit niyang justification to answer that Filipino is different from Tagalog.
Mas malawak daw ang Filipino kaysa Tagalog.
Daw.
Filipino today, according to Dr. Jessie Grace Rodrigo, is an amalgamation of Filipino o Tagalog, Spanish, and a preponderance for English.
Ang weird ng ano niya dito, di ba? Parang kasi siya Filipino o Tagalog, pero yung kinu-question niya dito na magkaiba sila.
Spelled forms. So are they separate languages? Some see Tagalog as the pure.
So naging separate, tanong niya ay separate language, and he raises the contention that Tagalog is a purist language. So ngayon pa lang sasabihin ko na sa inyo that this is BS.
Tourist language. Walang halong hiram na salita. Halimbawa, ang magsulat sa blackboard ay Filipino, habang ang magsulat sa pisara ay Tagalog. Ang salitang
Balik tayo doon na. So according to Hidarian, Tagalog is a purist language, which is why he uses the example ang magsulat sa blackboard ay Filipino habang ang magsulat sa pisara ay Tagalog. Sorry, wait lang. So ang magsulat sa unang mali sa lahat yung example niya na ganun lamang ng ganun kasimpleng comparison, because like for example, balay nga ba to? It can be Ilocano, it can be Cebuano, it can be Hiligaynon, because um yun because yung you don't judge that a language based on its individual parts, but as a whole. So further, the problem with his examples with Tagalog ang magsulat sa Pisara is that Pisara is a loan word from Spanish, Pisara. I don't even know how to properly pronounce it in Spanish, but it is from Spanish. Further, even before there was an idea of a national language in 1935, and even before the Spanish even came here in the Philippines, Tagalog has been loaning words from all sorts of languages like Sanskrit with muka, Arabic, salamat, Persian, salawal. So Tagalog is not a purist language because it has been borrowing from all sorts of languages. And even if we disregard foreign languages or non-Austronesian language, Tagalog has been borrowing from other local languages like Kapampangan. So examples of borrowings from Kapampangan of Tagalog are bayani, dayami. Those words. So yung argument ni Hidarian dito na Tagalog ay purest language ay BS. So yan, Filipino ay hindi mas malawak sa Tagalog because it is just Tagalog.
ang departamento ay Filipino pero hindi Tagalog dahil kagawaran ang Tagalog nito. Kayo, ano sa tingin nyo?
Actually, yung di ba Filipino ay ginagamit ng national government, but kagawaran ng kalusugan. Pero bakit kagawaran ng kalusugan yung tawag nila sa Department of Health? So medyo medyo nakaka-disappoint tong stand episode na to because hindi ko ginigisa si Richard Hidarian dito na because but common sense lang to. It should be common sense, and GMA has the resources to properly do this. So yeah, nakaka-disappoint. So kagaya nga nasabi ko sa disclaimer that some people who are students or even graduates of even prestigious universities are making mistakes that are rather ridiculous when it comes to the national language discussions because they don't understand the aspects. So, balikan lang natin ang ating summary ng theoretical framework because I put emphasis on this. To properly view the national language, we must view or recognize its two aspects, that there is a political or legal aspect and there is a linguistic or realistic aspect. The legal or political aspect is the mandate to be followed, whereas the linguistic or realistic aspect is the barometer for us to know whether or not the mandate rather is actually being followed. This means that the mandate is the national language should be Filipino. And we can only know whether or not that is actually being implemented correctly by using tools of linguistics. It cannot be justified just because there is actually a mandate. The mandate is not the justification for itself. So basically that's it. End of discussion. So thank you for listening.